everyone's often saying we should just do everything via email now. Like that's a big thing. But what many organizations I talk to don't realize is that sometimes too, email can be super unproductive. Usually the main criteria that I look at is, are we relaying information or are we trying to really have a back and forth here? In the latter case, meetings are good. Thinking about who really needs to be here or not. And then also thinking about the complexity of information. Where email goes really bad is where you want to ask clarifying questions. In a meeting, it's really quick for people to go back and forth with that. But when you're doing it over email, it can take hours to get, or days even in some cases, to get a response. So you're even hesitant to ask the question just because it's going to drag out the interaction so much longer.
I'm Patrick J. McGinnis, and I coined the term FOMO. That's short for fear of missing out, and it's why some people end up following the crowd when they should be blazing a trail of their own. But if you want to achieve greatness in business and life, you've got to break free. Come on, I'll show you how. This is FOMO Sapiens, where we explore how entrepreneurial thinkers find the inspiration and the courage to build exceptional lives. Welcome back to FOMO Sapiens, the show for entrepreneurial thinkers. I'm your host, Patrick J. McGinnis, and today we are talking to Andrew Brodsky, author of Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication. Now, Andrew is a Harvard Business School doctoral graduate, an award-winning business professor, management consultant, and expert in virtual communication at the University of Texas, Austin. He has dedicated his career to unraveling the intricacies of virtual communication. Diagnosed with cancer as a teenager, his treatment led to a lifetime immune deficiency, which has resulted in years of his life where his interactions were confined primarily to the virtual realm. This experience has given him a unique understanding of the challenges and nuances of communicating from a distance. All right, Andrew, welcome to FOMO Sapiens.
Great. Thanks for having me on today.
My pleasure. This is a topic that we were just talking before we press play. It feels like one of these things that now that I've had a little distance from the pandemic, I'm ready to think about some more. I hate saying the P word here, but it did happen. So we will talk about all of that. But before we do, let us start with the same question I ask every guest on this show. And the question is this: tell me something unexpected you learned about yourself that changed everything.
So something unexpected that I learned about myself that changed everything. It probably was when I began my doctoral program. As you noted, when I was younger, when I was 16, I was diagnosed with cancer, I had a bone marrow transplant. So I had spent a good bit of time in isolation, even from a young age. So I thought I was really had this virtual communication thing down well. But then I started my doctoral program with some of the smartest professors I've ever met. And my communication kept falling flat. I kept missing the mark. I was occasionally offending people. So for me, trying to understand how to do this better was really valuable, not just for helping others, but for my personal perspective of I actually want to accomplish what I'm trying to, and I'm just not getting it through my communication.
Yeah, I saw this book is blurred by Nir Eyal, who's a friend, and he always says research is me search. Other people say that, but that's where I first discovered it. And it is true that sometimes the best books and research come from our own lived experience. Talk about, you talk about a little bit about why you wrote this book in terms of your own personal experience, but for the rest of us, what is the reason to pick this up and read it, and what will we learn?
So that's a good question. The reason why I decided to do this book right now is I've seen so many stories in the media and the news. Is remote work good? Is remote work bad? We've got executives on both sides. We now have government officials on both sides of the argument. And here's the thing that all of those pieces are missing. Whether you're remote, whether you're hybrid, whether you're in person, we're all virtual communicators. Even when you're going back to the office these days, it used to be you'd go to someone's cubicle, you'd go to their office, and anytime you had a question. Now that's just seen as rude. To go over and walk and interrupt someone's work when you have a question is often seen as offensive. So what people do is they send each other an instant message or an email from even like 6 feet away in the workplace. So regardless of where you're bringing people back to, we're all using these communication technologies as a core means in which we interact.
Yeah, I guess what I hadn't thought about is that you have email and you have Zoom and work teams and all that stuff. But then if you think about it, like you have Slack, you have WhatsApp, you have, I mean, some people do Instagram kind of stuff. You have many, many platforms, not just video platforms, but texting communication platforms that have become captive to the world of work. And I think I hadn't thought about that until just this moment, but it goes far beyond just this, sort of what we think of as the life on Zoom and like remembering to press the unmute button. So it is a much broader scale. Let's step back for a second and talk about, that in-person versus remote thing. The assumption, the default has always been, if it's an important meeting, I need to go sit with this person and have that conversation. But first of all, a lot of people aren't in the office anymore, or they're partially remote. Second of all, you have global teams. And so even if you really wanted to, you're going to see them more than, once in a while. So talk about that sort of bias that we all have, that in person is better. Is that true? Are there occasions when it is?
Mm-hmm. So we all have our minds that just gets like stuck in the status quo and what we're used to. So we're always comparing things to in person. And that's what we assume is best. And we need a reason for in person to be worse very clearly for us to switch to email or something else. And this logic is super problematic. It's why so many people have hours and hours of meetings every week that are completely pointless. And there's a lot of research showing that there's a lot of situations where in person's worse, even video's worse. So for instance, if you want to brainstorm something as a group, research shows that it's better that you actually do that virtually and separately initially, because when you're all in a room together, you're concerned people are judging you. Only one person can talk at a time. One person says an idea, and then you all anchor your ideas to that person's idea. So like that's just a quick example of where this is far better for us just to do email separately. Not only do we have a better outcome, but it saves us a ton of time. So as opposed to thinking, okay, let's do in person, and unless there's a strong reason to do something else, let's stick in person, kind of taking it from a blank slate and just saying, okay, here's our goal, which approach is best, ends up making just everyone happier at work.
Give me a couple of examples of that. Like let's start from the bottom up and pick a task and then help me design how I would then virtually achieve that task.
Yeah, of course. So basically, big question is always meetings versus emails. So everyone's often saying we should just do everything via email now. Like that's a big thing. Shopify is an example. An organization is trying to get rid of as many meetings as absolutely possible. But what many organizations I talk to don't realize is that sometimes too, email can be super unproductive. For instance, this podcast that you and I are having right now is an example of something we could be doing. We're going to have it. It's going to take 30 minutes, maybe an hour of back and forth questions. If you would email me these questions to respond to, each of my answers is, 3, 6 paragraphs. It would take me days to respond to this over email. So having this live is really one of the best options. So usually the main criteria that I look at is, are we relaying information or are we trying to really have a back and forth here? In the latter case, meetings are good. Thinking about who really needs to be here or not. And then also thinking about the complexity of information. Where email goes really bad is where you want to ask clarifying questions. In a meeting, it's really quick for people to go back and forth with that. But when you're doing it over email, it can take hours to get, or days even in some cases, to get a response. So you're even hesitant to ask the question just because they're going to drag out the interaction so much longer.
FOMO. It's funny you say email because I think about email. I don't know about you. I've become to loathe email. And I see email as this sort of enemy in my life. And I want instant gratification. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so I'll instead of sending the email, I'll send the WhatsApp, I'll send the text message or the Slack or whatever. But I imagine email, you're using it as a catch-all in some way to think about verbal versus written communication. But when you get into like a level down, thinking about how organizations use text-based communication, is email, I mean, should we all go back to email? Is that like, it's kind of like it's very like, it reminds me of like slow food, I think it's called, where like, remember that trend where it's like, no, fast food, so we want everything considered and slow. And so with email, there is like, at least I sort of batch everything and respond. There is like a different kind of mindset vis-a-vis some other sort of written communications. Like how does one think about that in terms of setting up a company culture communication?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, in the previous example, it's a good observation. I was using email more as a catch-all for text communication.
Yeah.
It's really interesting these days. There used to be a major difference between texting someone and email in terms of actual functionality. And same thing for instant messaging. So, only email could have attachments, only email could have images. Now they all pretty much have identical functionality for the most part, and we're looking at them all on our smartphone. So they're not that functionally different from one another, but they still feel different, and we still have different expectations of them. So if someone sends me a Slack or instant message or message in Teams, I'm going to respond a lot quicker than if I get an email, because that's clear. That's the expectation in those situations. There's also something that just feels more informal about sending a text message, whereas an email feels really formal. Dear sir, I wish you could respond at your closest convenience. Whereas a text message feels like it's kind of to a friend and a little bit more casual. So each of those dimensions are really useful. In the book, I break apart the different communication media. So the two main categories that researchers often talk about is richness, so the degree of nonverbal behavior, cues, all that stuff. And then secondarily, synchronicity, which is the degree to which things are real time or have quicker response rates. And even small differences on these dimensions can have a big implication. So in-person versus video that we're having right now, you would think they're pretty similar because we can see each other, they're the same, but video lags very, very slightly because of data transmit speeds, which results in us being more likely to interrupt each other, to have awkward pauses while we're waiting to make sure the other person's done, because it messes up the conversation just a little bit. So knowing how those communication vary is really key to making sure that you make the right strategic choice on which mode to choose or not in a given situation.
Okay, so the 2x2, I'm going to be like a BCG consultant right now. The 2x2 is richness and synchronicity. I love this concept of richness. I thought it was a really good way of capturing this idea that, when you read a text message, you get, oftentimes we put our own sort of interpretations into things because we have less data. Versus when you're talking to somebody, you obviously going to have your own cognitive bias, but you sort of get a lot more data to work with as you form that. The trade-off of that is like getting the person on the phone, getting in front of them, whatever, or not the phone, but the Zoom, and or getting in front of them versus like the text message, which is instantaneous, as you mentioned, and probably will get a response because culturally we do see, it's like you've got your mom and your girlfriend and then the work person, and it's sort of like all mixed in, right? But what I kind of wonder about is also our own sense of focus when we do these things, because I will tell you that when I send a text message or I send a WhatsApp, I don't do that from a checked out place. I'm very engaged. Like I'm like, what should I write? I write it and send it. On Zoom calls, unless it's like a one-on-one and somebody is in charge of me or I am in charge of them, I'm generally checked out at this point. So there is this kind of interesting kind of trade-off between focus and I don't want to say lack of focus, but sort of like not being super plugged in. Has that kind of, how have you thought about that as you factor in the virtual elements of communication?
Yeah, so when it comes to being plugged in, I wouldn't necessarily say that's purely a mode choice. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm occasionally like texting people from the toilet, not like fully paying attention about it.
Listen, you're a brave man to communicate that to all the listeners of this show. So 10 points to you.
Yeah. So, it's not always an intense thing. The reason why Zoom and video makes you feel disconnected often is, one, when you have bigger group meetings and they're longer, it's just a drain. The other thing about video too is that research shows that because you're staring at yourself, you're literally looking at a reflection of yourself, and you're worried about your nonverbal behavior and all these other things going on. It's just more tiring, and that can be draining. So often in meetings, one of my recommendations is that you should turn cameras off in many cases, because it'll make everyone more engaged. You don't have to worry about doing your hair, of which for those watching the video, I have none. So it's an easier concern for me. But sometimes having the cameras off is better. And many people these days too, we thought you frame texting as something that is going to always have, lower cues and going to potentially be a little less synchronous. But now people are using, especially younger people, are using Snapchat and other video modes of texting. So there are richer modes of this kind of texting going on here. So it's not necessarily either or. Voice notes is something that's starting to get picked up a lot, and there's a lot of debate about that, where some people are getting really annoyed about it, where others are like, well, this is a good way to just kind of have something that's a little bit more rich than email or text to show that I care, to let them hear my voice and know that I mean what I'm saying. So there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of nuance here between all that stuff.
I love that you brought up voice notes because they're so deeply triggering. I actually have on my WhatsApp, it says, I don't listen to voice notes on my screen because when I get them, I actually feel it creates an obligation for somebody to set up a time part of their day to listen to something that takes a minute 30 when you could have read it in 20 seconds. So for me, it's sort of like I would trade for synchronicity, even though it is nice sometimes to hear. And I think it's more like, usually it's power dynamic. The boss leaves the voice note for the subordinate, who then has to, write back because they don't want to waste the boss's time. So a very interesting dynamic. When you talk about, so we've sort of mentioned, coming into this, that the reason you wrote this book is because you had to learn to be a better virtual communicator. Now, you've mastered that, and we all do, because as you said earlier, this is the cat's out of the bag, especially on global teams. Like, I spend so much of my time on Zooms with people all over the world. And, sometimes I think turning off the camera is awesome. And in fact, I like the traditional old phone call. Like, it feels like it's 2019 and it's great. But if you are in virtual communication and the culture of your firm is around that, or it's just part of what you do, we should just figure out a way to be better at it. I mean, it's time to just sort of like level up on that entire area of business. And so having done this yourself, help us to pop on screen. Like, what can we do to be more impactful communicators in virtual communication?
So when it comes to being impactful, there's a whole lot of advice, but I'm going to try and pick one piece that I find most useful. Mm-hmm. So it's probably be taking the initiative to think about what's missing in whatever mode you choose. So for instance, small talk. Many of us hate it. It feels like a waste of time. But here's the thing. It is a waste of time, but it serves the benefit. It helps us to get to know about other people. Research shows that it builds trust. If there's someone you've never talked to except for about work-related tasks, you don't feel like you really know that person. And when it comes to text-based communication, there's generally going to be no small talk. Even with video, there's going to be a little bit less. So just taking the initiative for something like adding in just a small bit in an email, just asking them something about their personal life and noting something small about what you did can really help create more trust in the communication. And when it comes to virtual communication, we're usually staring at just an email, a screen, or even a video. I'm just staring at a very small square of you. And because of that, the other person there is not really salient. We don't trust them. We don't realize we're interacting with a human being. When you find ways to bring that humanness back into your virtual communication, it can really make the whole experience itself richer and more beneficial and more likely to achieve your outcomes. And I'm not saying like a 10 paragraph long TMI email about everything you did in the last few weeks, but just putting in a little bit of that small talk and taking initiative to do other things that might be missed similarly in less rich communication can go a long way.
Yeah, I can see that would build camaraderie. I'm curious, in your own communications, do you have a standard go-to? Are you like a freestyler? Like, how do you achieve that in your own communication?
For building camaraderie, one of the best pieces of advice that I often give is just ask other people. We all have assumptions about this mode is best, or this approach is best. But actually just asking the other person, if I'm setting up a meeting, saying, hey, would you prefer phone, video? What's best for you? It really goes a long way, because people can choose what they like most, and then they want to interact with me more, and then they have a better time on it because they have their own preferences. And when it comes to my own nonverbal behavior during virtual communication, I often get the question, should you use emojis? Should you use exclamation marks? Like all these weird cues and things.
No.
So the research is mixed on this, actually. So
really?
Research shows some benefits, shows some downsides to it. So I don't recommend it. What I do recommend, though, which matches the science, is using something called language mimicry. So if the other person is using exclamation marks or emoticons, you use them. If they're not, you don't. If they have long emails, they prefer probably longer emails. If they have very short ones, they probably prefer really short ones. I have a funny story in a book about a colonel and a general in the U.S. military who actually communicate very often via emoticons with one another, and it's like completely unexpected for this colonel. But the general initially sent him some like American flag and smiley faced emojis, and the colonel was like, maybe I should just try and respond with the same. And they built this like really trusting long-term relationship because they have like this inside joke where they're just like texting each other emoticons. So again, don't start texting people emoticons out of the blue because that is some really bad advice in a whole variety of situations. But think about what the other person's doing and then match what they do, because we all think we're communicating the right way. So when someone else does what we do, we're like, wow, that person's smart. They know just the right thing to do because it's what we do.
That is fascinating. And okay, I just want to repeat what you said because I think it's very smart, which is that, you know, you kind of pick up on the codes of other people. And it's kind of like, I remember getting this advice, like when you're interviewing for a job, if the person sits a certain way, you should, you know, do the same with your body. And it sounds so stupid, but at the same time, it does work. I mean, the research does show that, and it's a nice little tip. Or even just in communication with them verbally, just sort of trying to match them that way. So why not do it in the virtual? Now, I have heard, I'm sure you saw this article, and I thought I'm sure this is very dodgy science, but it was saying that like, if you use a thumbs up with Gen Z, it's like extremely triggering to them. Did you see this? It was probably in like the New York Post because, you know, that's the kind of stuff they'll write about. But there is an interesting question around, as you do this, there may be practices that really signal how different you are from people. And so we also need to be tolerant of each other. So there's risk around it too, if you're not paying attention to what's happening.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And there's so many weird things that people get offended by in virtual communication. So it's always good to be attentive, take the other person's perspective, think about how would they likely interpret this message. And if you ever notice that there's a problem, bring it to richer communication. As you talked about earlier, have that phone call. It can really help solve those misunderstandings.
Yeah. Let me ask you one question about my own personal challenge, which is, and I'll tell you how I became really aware of this. So a friend of mine got into some trouble, somebody I knew a long time ago, and we were all part of a friend group, and we all emailed a lot. This was like this was a long time ago, like people didn't text as much. And our emails made it into a court case and then were disclosed and then were written about in a major publication. I did nothing wrong, by the way. I was just in the room.
Of course.
However, I had a really funny email that was in there that was it was hilarious. And they printed it. But not with my name, thank God. But it was full of typos. Full of typos. I'm telling you something. It looked like a 4-year-old wrote it. And what I have learned is that the vast majority of texts and WhatsApps I send and an email, unless I run it through Grammarly, are just riddled with typos, which tells you, I mean, that's a lot of a psychoanalysis of Patrick McGinnis. Like, is that really bad? Like, how should I think about that?
So typos was actually one of my biggest issues when I started as a doctoral student at Harvard. My advisor was one of those like grammar intense people that anytime there was even a single typo in an email, she would point it out. So I was like, I got to research this. So I did a study with Haley Blunden, who's over at American University, where we looked at the impact of it. So just first, more broadly as a setting, if you know someone really well, your impression's not going to change of them based on a typo or not. So kind of it's stuck. But in newer situations, we see, not surprisingly, that typos make people look a lot less intelligent. But we also found is that there's often a lot of other attributions people make for typos. And if there's another reason for it, you're not seen as less intelligent. So for instance, in an emotional context, you're penalized less for typos because they're like, oh, the person made that typo because they're angry, as opposed to they're dumb. Or if there's other situations where there's another good set of studies where it showed if they knew someone was from a different culture and English wasn't their first language, then they're like, oh, the typos are because they're, not a native English speaker, not because they're less intelligent. So if you're having those typos like in a really important work email and you realize it after the fact, being able to note some other attribution for it can be really useful. I wouldn't say, oh, I was angry. But if you said something like, hey, just reread my email, saw there were a lot of typos. I wanted to get you as quickly as possible. So I sent it before I even kind of went through it. That'll change their perception of, hey, this person's really dumb to, oh, they were just working really quickly here. And that's why sometimes you see that sent from my iPhone thing in people's signature. Yeah. There's actually research that backs it up that shows that that reduces the impact that typos make you seem less intelligent, because people say, oh, it's due to the smartphone. So we're always searching for these reasons. So just making sure to provide a reason that's strategic and beneficial to you, as opposed to you're just dumb and unintelligent and don't know how to write, can be really useful in those situations.
I should just put a little thing that says I multitask a lot, and therefore you only have a small part of my brain and I'm rushing.
Exactly. And I mean, in that case, people would assume it's because you're important, probably, and it's just not that relevant to you.
Why do you got to assume when it's true? FOMO. FOMO. All right. So last question before the lightning round, which is looking to the future. I mean, so you might have heard of AI. Have you heard about this thing?
A little bit.
Yeah, it's wow. But no, in all seriousness, it is interesting. Like I envision this future where like there will be no email because their chatbots will just talk to each other, and I'm totally chill with that. But where are things going? Like what do you see as the future as you look forward?
Sure. So at least let me start with AI. So one of the pieces of advice I have is you should not let your AI write important emails for you. So for those repetitive, easy, simple emails that don't matter, sure, use AI. But for important emails, you want those in your own words. The reason being is that it's possible occasionally for people to realize that AI wrote the email. For instance, aside from the normal hallucinations, maybe it uses words that you don't use, like elevate. Or the other thing is AI doesn't know everything that's inside your brain, at least not yet, until they start putting brain chips in us or whatever.
Right.
But like, let's say over the weekend, we talked about how you had a car crash recently. And then AI writes an email, the day afterwards saying, I hope you're doing well, and like completely misses that fact. All it takes is one time of the other person realizing that you're using AI to communicate with them. And then they'll question every single message you sent of whether or not you did it. And when you don't write the message yourself, it just seems like you don't care. The person starts to question like, why am I even communicating with this person at all? So there's this huge risk of using it. So when it matters, you definitely want to use your own words on this stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I was talking to somebody who does a lot of social media stuff. And I was like, wow, it must be easy for you now with all this writing all these posts. And they were like, I don't, because it's, even though you would think her view was that people can just kind of tell. It feels a little different, and I don't have proof of that, but you could test that out and just like do your LinkedIn posts with AI and then write them and just see how the engagement goes, and you'll probably get some data around that. But it's very good for correcting typos, and so we like it for that. Let's do the lightning round. You ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. Andrew, starting with this first question, what is a favorite quote?
Favorite quote, live to live, not live to work.
Love that. Number 2, this is a new question, so this is exciting. Favorite use case for ChatGPT?
Initial grading of student papers.
Oh my goodness. I love, but not the final grade, the initial.
Not the final grade. You still need that human touch always, because then otherwise people are going to question, why do they even need a professor in the first place?
It's cool though when you train the chatbot to think like to understand kind of what's important to you. Then it can kind of help you do things. It's very cool. Number 3, what's a piece of advice you give to your younger self?
Don't worry as much about the future and live more in the present.
Yeah, that's a good one. And number 4, what's your most important memory?
My most important memory was when I proposed to my wife. We actually did in a lighthouse up in Massachusetts, and it was easily one of the happiest moments of my life.
Do you recommend virtual proposals, or do you think it's an in-person kind of thing?
I'd have to say that's definitely going to be an in-person kind of thing. And there's many things like that. Like you don't want to, if you're sharing a meal, it just doesn't work the same while you're, miles and miles away. It's one of those things you just got to be there in physical proximity.
Yeah, Zoom happy hours were the big bust
disaster
of the pandemic. Yeah. Disaster. All right, if you want to learn more about Andrew. You can find him on LinkedIn, Andrew S. Brodsky. You can find him on Twitter, X, at Andrew S. Brodsky. Andrew Brodsky, author of the book Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
FOMO Sapiens is recorded in New York City and can be found on YouTube at FOMO Sapiens or on your favorite podcast network. Theme music is by Mike McGinnis, editing and post-production is by Josh Elstro, and the show is produced by Matt Curtis and me. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and share it with your friends. And as always, you can find more about the show and me at FOMOSapiens.com and PatrickMcGinnis.com.